Buckingham Palace statement on King Charles's health. Picture the palace at night, when the lights are fewer and the corridors feel longer than they look on daytime tours. A set of doors closes softly somewhere off camera. Footsteps fade. And then, down to the last, carefully chosen syllable, a statement appears. Not a speech. Not a confession. A statement. And in Washington, London, Ottawa, Canberra, and Berlin, people read it the same way insiders always do. Not only for what it says, but for what it must, absolutely, avoid saying. Because when Buckingham Palace speaks about a monarch's health, it isn't gossip. It's governance in formal wear. It's national identity in plain text. It's the crown signaling continuity, without ever sounding like it's signaling anything at all. So let's talk, quietly, clearly, about the Buckingham Palace statement on King Charles's health, and why it's refocused global attention on the future of the crown. And yes, the question hanging in the air, the one you can see on every thumbnail, in every timeline debate, in every carefully, respectful, headline is the same. King Charles III, concerned. Prince William. What now? Because tonight, Buckingham Palace released a new statement that has refocused global attention on the future of the crown. And that single fact changes how every handshake, every appearance, every constitutional formality will be interpreted for weeks, maybe months, to come. Here's the part almost nobody outside the corridors of power fully understands: a palace statement is never just about health. It's a tool of stability. A message to the public, yes, but also to ministers, diplomats, Commonwealth realms, markets, and the wider world that depends on predictability. This is not just ceremony, it is the living thread of continuity. And when that thread is even slightly tugged, everyone feels it. Now, the most advertiser-safe, most factual way to frame what we know is this: King Charles has been undergoing treatment for cancer, and Buckingham Palace has used carefully controlled updates to convey both transparency and steadiness, without turning a constitutional role into a medical bulletin. In recent palace statements, Buckingham Palace has emphasized that the king remains deeply engaged with his duties while continuing medical treatment, using carefully chosen language to balance transparency with stability. Those updates are designed not just to inform the public, but to reassure governments, markets, and international partners that the crown remains anchored. That's a public health message on the surface. But it's also something else, a deliberate reinforcement that the sovereign remains present, purposeful, and engaged. And the moment you read that kind of wording, the mind automatically goes to the next question. Not, is he okay? Though of course people ask it, sincerely. But, how is the institution preparing? How does the system flex? Who absorbs the strain if the king can't be as visible? And if you're thinking that right now, you're already in the story. Because the monarchy is built to look personal, while functioning as institutional. It is, in a strange way, a national brand whose most important product is continuity. National identity is woven into these rituals, binding past and present in a single moment. Which brings us to the first pressure point that's easy to miss if you only read headlines: visibility. When a king is healthy, visibility is effortless. Appearances feel like tradition. Smiles feel like normality. Routine feels like a permanent condition. But when a king is managing treatment, even with strength, even with discipline, visibility becomes strategy. And that strategy has two audiences at once: the public that wants reassurance, and the state that requires reliability. So let me ask you the question that palace watchers quietly ask each other when a statement lands like this. If the palace is choosing these words, what are they trying to prevent you from imagining? Because the imagination is where instability starts. And once the imagination runs ahead of the facts, you get the dangerous gap between what is known and what is assumed. So here's our first cliffhanger, right on schedule. If the statement is meant to calm the public, why does it so often intensify global speculation instead? Hold that thought. Now zoom out with me, beyond the palace gates, to the way different countries interpret this moment. Observers in the US and UK frame this moment differently, yet the continuity echoes across continents. In the United States, the conversation tends to be framed through personality, family dynamics, and media cadence: who appears, who doesn't, what the optics suggest, what the next major event will look like on camera. Americans are used to power being fought for in public. So they naturally read silence as a clue. In the UK, the framing is more constitutional, even when it's emotional. The monarchy is not just a famous family. It's a component of the state, threaded through parliamentary tradition, civic ritual, military symbolism, and the very texture of national life. So a statement about the king's health is heard as an institutional heartbeat, steady, or strained. Canada and Australia see this gesture as symbolic, but Germany interprets it as constitutional resilience. That's not just a clever line. It's real. In Canada and Australia, Commonwealth realms where the king is head of state, the monarchy often lives as a symbol in daily life, flaring into relevance at moments of ceremony, crisis, or debate. A health statement can reignite questions that are always somewhere underneath: identity, tradition, and the future shape of the constitutional relationship. In Germany, where monarchy isn't part of the constitutional structure, the fascination is different. It's about institutional design, about how a centuries-old system manages human fragility while preserving state continuity. German audiences, especially political and diplomatic circles, tend to view these updates as case studies in stability and protocol. And all of that global reading, across 5 countries, 5 media ecosystems, creates a feedback loop. The more the world watches, the more every royal movement becomes meaningful. The more meaningful it feels, the more pressure the palace feels to speak carefully. The more carefully it speaks, the more people study the negative space between the lines. Which brings us to the second retention beat. At around minute 4 or 5, we have to return to the hook, because the palace knows you're thinking it. King Charles III, concerned. Prince William. What now? Because the real story isn't only what the statement says about health. It's what it does to the narrative of succession, quietly, indirectly, but unmistakably. And succession isn't just a dramatic concept. It's the constitutional guarantee that the state doesn't wobble when one human body does. This is not just ceremony, it is the living thread of continuity. So let's talk about the pressure that arrives next: the heir's visibility. Prince William doesn't need to campaign. He doesn't need to position. In fact, the more it looks like positioning, the more it risks unsettling the very continuity he represents. So the balance is delicate: appear supportive, not ambitious; present, not premature; steady, not staged. That's why, in moments like this, you'll see a subtle choreography across calendars, patronages, and protocol. It's not theatrical, but it is intentional. And it's designed to communicate one message without ever saying it out loud. The institution holds. Now for our next cliffhanger, because there's always one detail that separates normal royal scheduling from contingency planning. If you look closely, what matters most is not what gets announced. It's what gets delegated. When certain duties shift, when a particular category of engagement is quietly handled by the heir, or by other senior royals, the palace is telling you something about where the load-bearing beams are. So here's the question to keep in your pocket: which responsibilities are nice to have, and which are must be seen, for continuity to feel real? Because continuity is not abstract here, it is embodied in visible presence. And when presence becomes selective, the world tries to decode the selection. Now let's move into what I'll call the 3 clues, 3 areas where you can understand the palace statement's impact without drifting into rumor. First, body language and pacing. Not the cruel, tabloid version. The realistic one. When a public figure is managing treatment, the cadence of appearances shifts: shorter engagements, fewer spontaneous moments, more controlled photo opportunities. That doesn't automatically mean anything dire. It means logistics. It means conserving energy. It means planning for the work to continue. But the public doesn't interpret logistics as logistics. It interprets logistics as narrative. Second, media reports versus palace phrasing. Media outlets, especially in the US and UK, will often describe events in emotional terms: concern, worry, fears, uncertainty. The palace, by contrast, speaks in governance language: treatment, monitoring, duty, encouraged. The palace is not trying to entertain you. It is trying to stabilize you. And when the emotional language outruns the governance language, that's when speculation becomes a storm. Third, protocol highlights. Watch the ritual moments. Not for drama, for continuity. Who attends which events? Who represents the king? Which ceremonies are prioritized? Which messages are issued in the king's voice? Which projects he remains visibly committed to. These are not random choices. They are the public-facing architecture of constitutional reassurance. National identity is woven into these rituals, binding past and present in a single moment. Now, right around minute 7 or 8, we need the second cliffhanger, and I want to make it sharp, because it goes straight to the heart of why statements like this are released when they are. Ask yourself, is the palace responding to health, or responding to the public's reaction to health? Because that's the pivot. A statement can be prompted by medical reality, yes. But it can also be prompted by narrative acceleration, by the sense that the story has started running without them. And when that happens, the palace doesn't clarify. It reasserts control through tone. So the cliffhanger is this: if the palace is choosing to speak now, what changed in the background that made silence the riskier option? Hold that, because it leads directly into the most delicate part of the entire subject, the future of the crown. And here's where we stay factual and advertiser safe. There is no single event that hands over everything at once in day-to-day terms. The system is designed to be continuous. Duties can be performed, represented, shared, delegated. The crown is one office, but its public presence is distributed across a family firm, under strict protocol, so that the state never looks empty. That's not glamour. That's governance. Observers in the US and UK frame this moment differently, yet the continuity echoes across continents. In the UK, there's a deep cultural memory of sovereign transitions. People remember how swiftly the machinery turns, how ceremonial language becomes operational reality, how grief and duty can occupy the same sentence. In the US, the fascination often centers on the human story, father and son, tradition and modernity, the burden of inheritance. It's relatable, even if the constitution is different. And in Canada and Australia, the conversation can become quietly existential. What does the crown mean to us, now, in this decade, in this political climate? Is continuity comfort, or constraint? While Germany, watching from outside the Commonwealth structure, tends to see it as a demonstration that institutions can be built to outlast individuals, if they're designed with redundancy, ritual, and public legitimacy. Now we're approaching the midpoint, and this is where the escalation tease belongs, because something always changes at the midpoint of a royal story. You think this is just about health updates. You think the statement is just reassurance. But the real escalation is the way a health statement transforms every future appearance into a referendum on continuity. A walk becomes a signal. A smile becomes evidence. An absence becomes a headline. And a prince standing one step closer to the center becomes unavoidable. So here's the midpoint tease, exactly where it should land. The next phase of this story won't be written by what the palace says, it will be written by what the palace schedules. And that means you and I should pay attention to one question above all others. When the cameras arrive, who is placed where? Because that's where continuity becomes visible. This is not just ceremony, it is the living thread of continuity. Now let's echo the thumbnail again, because at the midpoint, the audience is always looking for the same emotional anchor. King Charles III, concerned. Prince William, what now? Now, let's be honest about why that phrase hits so hard. It sounds like panic, but underneath, it's a continuity question. It's the public asking, is the system prepared? Is the national story stable? Is there a plan that doesn't rely on pretending human bodies don't get sick? And the answer, quietly, is yes. The institution is built for this. But the institution also depends on perception. And perception depends on communication. So what does the palace statement actually do, in practical terms? It sets boundaries. It tells the press what not to ask. It signals to foreign governments that the UK's head of state remains engaged, monitored, and supported. It offers the public a lane to feel concern without spiraling. And it provides a moral frame, often through duty, service, and a wider cause. In the December 2025 example, that cause was cancer screening, a way to convert personal vulnerability into public good. And that's a powerful tool, because it anchors the monarch's role in service rather than spectacle. But here comes the next cliffhanger, around minute 13 or 14, and it's the kind that makes palace officials grit their teeth. If a statement can stabilize, it can also create a new baseline. Once the palace has spoken, the world expects it to speak again. And if the next update is delayed, or phrased differently, or noticeably thinner, people start measuring the gaps. So the cliffhanger is this: does the palace risk becoming trapped in a cycle where every attempt to reassure only increases the demand for reassurance? Because that's how narratives turn into obligations. And obligations, in a constitutional monarchy, are never trivial. National identity is woven into these rituals, binding past and present in a single moment. Now let's talk about Prince William, not as a character in a drama, but as a constitutional asset. In moments when the sovereign's health becomes a public topic, the heir's job is to embody steadiness, without implying imminence. It's a strange discipline. And it's why you'll often see William leaning into themes that are safe, state-adjacent, and socially stabilizing: community resilience, public service, mental health, early childhood development, veterans, causes that signal continuity with modern legitimacy. And the palace benefits from that, because it frames the monarchy as connected to real life, not floating above it. Canada and Australia see this gesture as symbolic, but Germany interprets it as constitutional resilience. Symbol and resilience, those two words are the whole game right now. Because when a monarch is ill, the symbolic role is heightened, people need the image of steadiness. But the resilience must be real. The state must continue, officials must function, diplomacy must hold. And diplomacy matters more than most people realize. When foreign leaders engage with the UK, the monarchy is part of the theatre of state. Not the policy engine, but a stabilizing emblem. Its continuity made visible. And in an age of rapid political swings, that visibility becomes its own kind of soft power. In Berlin, for instance, the interest is not in royal drama. It's in whether Britain's institutional signals remain coherent. In Washington, the calculus includes optics, alliance messaging, and public sentiment. In Ottawa and Canberra, it includes constitutional reflection alongside cultural connection. So yes, this is personal, but it's also geopolitical. Now, as we move toward the latter portion of our 20 to 25-minute arc, we need a safe foreshadow around minute 18 or 19. Something that prepares the viewer for the next act without sounding alarmist. Here it is. The next chapter will likely be defined by normal, but adjusted. Not a sudden rupture. Not a dramatic transfer. But a gradual recalibration. Fewer engagements here, more representation there, carefully chosen appearances that maximize reassurance while respecting health realities. And the foreshadow is simple: watch for the palace to emphasize continuity through ritual. Ritual is the monarchy's language when words become too risky. This is not just ceremony, it is the living thread of continuity. But here's our cliffhanger at this point, because there's always a twist hiding inside the calm. If the palace leans more heavily on ritual to reassure, will the public read it as strength, or as a substitute for transparency? Because the modern audience, especially in the US, Canada, and Australia, has a different relationship with authority than audiences did a generation ago. People want institutions to feel human, but not fragile. Honest, but not chaotic. Traditional, but not evasive. And that tension is where the story lives. Now let's bring it home, and make the final minute do what it's supposed to do. Echo the thumbnail, reinforce the legacy axis, and leave a forward-looking cliffhanger that tees up the next episode. King Charles III, concerned. Prince William. What now? Tonight, Buckingham Palace released a new statement that has refocused global attention on the future of the crown. And whether you're reading it in the UK as constitutional reassurance, in the US as a human story under a spotlight, in Canada and Australia as a symbolic hinge, or in Germany as a case study in institutional resilience, the message underneath the message is the same. Continuity is the point. National identity is woven into these rituals, binding past and present in a single moment. So what now? Now we watch how the palace manages the space between truth and stability, how it keeps the monarchy visible without turning it into a spectacle, how it protects a human being while safeguarding an office, how it signals that the state is steady, even when the public is anxious. And here's the forward-looking cliffhanger, the one that will decide how the next statement lands, and how the next phase of the crown is understood across Washington, London, Ottawa, Canberra, and Berlin. If the next major royal appearance is staged to reassure, what happens if the world notices it was staged? Because the palace can control words. It can control schedules. It can control protocol. But it cannot fully control interpretation. And in this story, interpretation is power. So as the cameras keep rolling and the statements keep coming, remember the quiet truth beneath all the pageantry. This is not just ceremony, it is the living thread of continuity. And the world is watching to see whether that thread holds, or whether it's about to be handed, more visibly than anyone expected, to the next pair of hands.